Hello and welcome back. Today we have our second installment in our lecture series on the 1920s in America. And as I alluded to in the first lecture, this unit is primarily going to focus more on society and social changes and norms going on within it. And then I went ahead and lectured you the entire first time about politics. So sorry about it. But now we're getting to some of the more social issues going on in America. We're going to be taking a look today at increasing ways of, changing ways of life in which the urban core is going to become much stronger. Populations in the cities are rising, and we're going to see, some of the effects of that. We're going to take a look at Prohibition, one of America's most unique moments in history. And then we're going to finish it off by taking a look at a critical debate that still happens today, and that is the role of science and religion. Can the two work together? We're going to see a famous case that evolved in the 1920s that tried to answer that question. So without further ado, go ahead and get your notes out and let's go ahead and jump into this. So as I introduced here, Americans' ways of life are changing, and part of that is due to our newfound prosperity. By the 1920s, Americans had become so prosperous that about 40% of the entire world's wealth is centered in America. Now, this is primarily due to the Industrial Revolution. It had been a booming success in America, and that has eventually led to rising levels of prosperity for all Americans, for most Americans. I should not say all, but a lot of wealth coming into the United States. A lot of people are buying our items. One thing that they are buying is automobiles, and not just Americans. People throughout the globe are buying American-made automobiles, and it led to a tremendous boom, especially in places like Detroit, Michigan. Now, the impact of the automobile cannot be overstated. Not only did Henry Ford create an automobile that was cheap enough that your middle-class income could actually afford it, but this also changed how Americans lived their lives. And I do want to remind you, Henry Ford did not invent the car, okay? The car was invented by someone else elsewhere, but what Henry Ford did was basically invent the best way to make a car, and that was through production line assembly work. And what you see here is that the ability to make cars is done very rapidly. It drives down the price, and it means that a lot more people have cars than ever before. Now, what this means is that people can now live outside of the city and work in the city. They're traveling via car every day, and that's something new. Most people have always basically worked wherever they lived. And so this leads to what's called urban sprawl. You're starting to see the birth of the suburbs at this time, where people are living outside and then coming into work. So American lifestyle is changing, and where we live is starting to change. Other things that lead to differences in transportation, the airplane, which we saw invented and used first in World War I in our notes, now it is being used to transfer passengers across the country, and eventually we're going to talk about people experimenting and even flying across the ocean, which was seen as just a marvel of mankind at the time. But people are getting places faster than ever before. The change of pace and lifestyle is changing as well. Now, a lot of people pointed to the fact that this may be what's called superficial or on-the-surface prosperity, because not every American could actually afford this lifestyle. So one thing you see from companies that emerge at this time are basically the beginnings of credit cards, okay, and our obsession with debt in this country. Many stores begin to offer installment plans. You can't pay for a whole car now? That's fine. Give us 20% down, and then you can pay it off with interest. Now, there's the key, and just my financial piece of advice for everyone: don't live outside your means, okay? Because even though you have the car in your possession, but you still owe 80% on that car, it's not your car, okay? So a lot of people are going to figure that out, but the 1920s were booming. They're roaring after all, so it seems like a great time. Hey, why not? My stocks are doing great. Why don't I go ahead and splurge and buy that car on credit? Why don't I buy that new refrigerator on credit, that new washing machine? A lot of people are going out buying goods on credit that frankly can't afford them, but times are good, okay? Now, if things happen where times are bad, all of a sudden, those items are going to start being repossessed. So 1929, it's coming. Now, the way of life for Americans is rapidly changing. And, just take the picture of these women here, these flapper girls. Women did not used to dress like this before this period. And, it was, and frankly, in some cities, it was illegal to show your leg above the knee. There are famous pictures of women and sometimes even men getting tickets at beaches because they're showing too much skin. Americans are starting to challenge even those norms. The cities have changed with immigration, and I feel like we talk about this every unit, but it was very impactful during this period where you have a lot of Europeans coming into especially East Coast cities, and it is changing a little bit about how those cities are made up. You can find food from all across the world in a matter of a few city blocks, and languages from all across the world. So the urban core is starting to change. Now, one thing that we talked about a little bit in the progressive era was the, frankly, experiment of prohibition. The idea was that if you get rid of alcohol, you'll be able to reduce the moral failings of the country, and that spirals down all the way through domestic abuse and just health for that matter. But what ends up happening once the constitutional amendment is passed, the 18th Amendment, which says that you cannot drink alcohol, cannot manufacture alcohol, sell alcohol, all of that, when that is passed, people did not stop drinking. Okay? All it did was it drove it into an underground market. Not a literal underground market, not a subway. I'm talking about buying it on the black market. Buying it from people who know it's illegal, okay, and are criminals, okay, for all intents and purposes. So now they may have been against it for moral reasons, but either way, what this means is that if you want to drink, you got to buy it from a criminal. All of a sudden, you start to have more illegal events happen, and in particular, there started popping up basically bars that were kind of hidden clubs called speakeasies, and they were called that way because when you were inside one of these hidden secret bars, you had to speak easy, or else you may be found out. So these hidden bars and start popping up everywhere, and again, who is supplying that alcohol? Eventually, it's going to be organized crime, and we're going to talk about that on the next slide. Another term you need to know are bootleggers, and this is a term applied to someone who is smuggling in this case, alcohol. It was very common, especially along the northern border, for people to go over into Canada to buy up a bunch of alcohol and then come back into the country with it, especially on the Great Lakes. They used to basically buy speedboats, load them up with alcohol on the Canadian side, and then outrun authorities on the American side. Speaking of it, it actually became a sport in places like Kentucky and Tennessee, where they actually began souping up cars in order to outrun police during Prohibition. And what you have there is the beginning of NASCAR. I'm dead serious. That is how NASCAR got started, with these guys basically souping up the cars to outrun police for Prohibition, and then started racing them. And it has turned into the modern sport that a lot of people love today. Now, like I said, if you are purchasing alcohol at this time, you're buying it from a criminal. That is someone that has made it or has at least purchased it, kind of a middleman. And odds are, especially if you were drinking in the northeast, if you were drinking, you were probably drinking mob alcohol. Organized crime is going to take off rapidly during this time because, again, people do not stop drinking. And so that means that every dollar of profit that's coming into the alcohol industry is now going to a criminal. And it doesn't take long for that to be organized. And so the rise of organized crime happens in the 1920s with, of course, Al Capone being the most famous gangster of all of them. Al Capone was a murderer. He was a horrible criminal. Now, we have kind of romanticized him during this period, but the fact is he was responsible for many murders across cities like Chicago and New York, and he controlled basically all the alcohol in those regions. Now, the The government knew he was responsible for this, but this is where you get into the organized part of organized crime, because Al Capone had such an organized operation that none of his lower level guys actually, even if they did get caught, would basically rat out the top guys. So Al Capone never actually got tied to his alcohol business. They did eventually arrest Al Capone, and he served out the remainder of his life in jail, but it was nothing to do with Prohibition. It was about tax evasion. So they didn't necessarily have to get him on the alcohol. They got him on something else, and he ended up going to prison for the rest of his life because of that. Prohibition was a total failure. Total failure. It had good intentions, but frankly, it is very difficult to make morality, to legalize morality. It's a very difficult thing to do. People continued to drink. People wanted to drink. They thought it was their right to drink. And even by the mid-turn of the century, by the mid-1920s, you have only 19% of Americans that actually supported Prohibition. They realized how horrible it was, and they watched their cities turn into crime-infested areas as gangsters are murdering each other for control of turf in major cities. This led to an era of lawlessness in America, to where criminals are becoming much more wealthy because of this, and they are becoming much more powerful. So it actually backfired. Instead of lowering crime, it actually raised crime. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out what a lot of historians have pointed to, the current drug war, in which you have a lot of criminals that have gotten very wealthy, in particular Mexican cartels that have been selling drugs in the United States for decades. And, the violence that is happening down in Mexico is a direct result of that drug trade, that drug war, a lot of other factors. But, we see Prohibition there in our own times. And, it's interesting to see how mentality has changed over time regarding that. But there are a lot of parallels between the prohibition of alcohol then and the prohibition of drugs today. That is not an endorsement of drugs, by the way. I'm just saying there's a connection there in which, that prohibition of or trying to legalize or make illegal, issues of morality often fails. Now, the final topic I want to discuss today deals with science and religion. In the 1920s, you have somewhat of a revival of religious fundamentalism in this country, kind of a return to the Bible roots and return to kind of strong Protestant views of the Bible and what's called fundamentalism. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but what you have is this return to very literal interpretations of the Bible, and especially this is in response to increasing scientific endeavors such as the focus on the theory of evolution. We're seeing science kind of rise up into a new era of study, and basically religion rises up to kind of meet that. And there's this major clash going on between science and religion. And nowhere was that more suitable or more subject to than in 1925 in the state of Tennessee. A teacher was arrested, a science teacher was arrested for teaching evolution to his classes. And in the state of Tennessee at the time, evolution, the theory of evolution, was not legal to teach. The only way you could teach about creation was through creationism, that God created the earth and that, so on as is interpreted by the Bible. Now, what made this case so unique is a couple different things. Number one, the two sides that are represented. You have the side of the science teacher, and then you have the state side here. You have two of the most famous lawyers at the end of their life that have ever existed in the United States. Now, you may not know their names, but these were household names in the 1920s. First of all, Clarence Darrow, who was a defense attorney, had already served as a defense attorney on many cases, some of which had already been called the trial of the century, like this trial would receive that moniker as well. But one of the best defense attorneys that America has ever seen, and like I said, was already a household name. On the other side, we have a man who we talked about previously in one of our lectures, and that is William Jennings Bryan, a three-time presidential candidate. We saw him during the Reform era rise up as the Democratic nominee, but also the nominee for the Progressive Party later on. And these two men are going at it in a hot courtroom in Tennessee, debating, frankly, evolution versus God. I mean, that's what it kind of comes down to. Now, the final factor that made this so interesting to people at the time was that this was one of the first court trials that was broadcast via radio. Radio is a brand new medium of technology, and by the mid-1920s, a lot of people are starting to get radio. And so you could tune in and you could actually listen to these two amazing lawyers go at it. And like I said, it became, after a couple days, it became less about the case itself, and it became more about an argument of science versus God. And to hear these two men, I mean, it became quite dramatic. At one point, William Jennings Bryan actually calls Clarence Darrow to the stand to basically argue for evolution. It turns into a crazy trial, and people all across the country and the world are tuning in to see who's going to win. Now, this becomes known, kind of funnily, as the Scopes Monkey Trial. And the Scopes Monkey Trial, ultimately, they found on the side of the state of Tennessee, and William Jennings Bryan won the case, which meant that creationism was the only thing allowed to be taught in schools in Tennessee, and evolution remained illegal. But regardless of what actually happened with the trial itself, what we saw here is that radio was now a major media within America. Lifestyles are changing. We are no longer getting our news just from newspapers. We're listening to our news. We're not just reading speeches in newspapers that presidents give. We're listening to them actually speak on the radio. That is mind-blowing to people, some of which have never traveled more than 5 miles away from their house. Now all of a sudden they're hearing the President of the United States come into their living room on the radio. That's a pretty amazing moment in American history. So what we're seeing here is there's a lot of clashes going on. There's a lot of, this clash between science and religion. There's this clash between tradition and kind of this new wave of dress and new wave of, urban versus rural. There's a lot of changes going on in America. And frankly, while change is sometimes welcome, a lot of times it is not. We are a very conservative, very traditional society. And so eventually, these clashes are going to get tiresome. And we're gonna see how that leads to kind of a changing mentality towards all of this in our next lecture. But that'll do it for me. It is one of our shorter lectures, so you might be cheering that. I don't know. But we are going to wrap it up for today. Next time, we will have our final lecture on the 1920s. We'll wrap up the entire semester, and we'll take a look at some national celebrities, if you will, and some individuals that kind of became famous, and some of the first real American celebrities. And we'll finish off by taking a look at what's happening in minority communities as well. We'll look at things like the Harlem Renaissance, and we'll see a revival, a return of this brand new wave of music that overtakes, again, with the help of the radio. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you next time.